In my last threat narrative installment, I talked about the slavery sweet spot, which was essentially a way of perpetuating slavery indefinitely by creating a slave that desires to dominate you, and through that dominance serves your benefit. Now, today I wanted to address something that I said in my previous threat narrative series, and that was that a system of slavery lasts as long as the slave is seen as less vulnerable than the master. Today I'm going to explain what that means. Imagine we have a guy named Stu who really, really loves Cracker Jack. Now Stu goes down to the corner store and buys himself a box of Cracker Jack. And he does this every so often just as a treat. And when he gets home and he opens up that box of Cracker Jack, he pops a bit of Cracker Jack into his mouth. And instead of that delicious salty caramel flavor, he feels a sharp jab of pain, slivering up his tooth into his jaw, into his ear, just this agonizing pain. He's broken his tooth on the Cracker Jack. Now after Stu goes to the dentist and gets his tooth fixed and finishes his round of antibiotics and the pain is gone, guess what he's probably going to do to celebrate? He's going to go down to the corner store and get another box of Cracker Jack. Now let's imagine instead Stu opens up this box of Cracker Jack. He's just salivating at the smell of the salt and the sweet caramel corn. And he picks up a handful of it and he eats it. And 15 minutes later, he gets violently ill. I'm talking ass in the toilet, head in a bucket, violently ill. Barfing and shitting at the same time for 2 or 3 days, just violently ill from this Cracker Jack. And after he goes through just the sickness finally eases and he goes through that week of queasy spasms that always last after you get really sick. What do you think he's going to do to celebrate? Well, he's not going to be eating Cracker Jack. In fact, he will probably avoid all food from that corner store for the rest of his life. That's the power of nausea, to cause you to avoid something. Nausea is a very powerful aversive force. And the reason why is because it keeps us alive. In the wild, if we ate something and it made us get sick, we never want to eat that again, because it might kill us if we did. Now, to understand why I'm telling you that particular anecdote, I'm going to explain what emotions are. When we're young, when we're gestating in the womb, and even for the first months of our life, our most predominant, our first sense to develop is tactility, our sense of touch. And for a long time after we're born, that's our predominant sense. Every other sense, and really our understanding of our environment and everything within it, is scaffolded on tactility. That means it reflects back to some sort of tactile experience we had. Now, what shame is an abstraction off of nausea. Shame is essentially a powerful incentive to avoid something that could get us killed. And to explain what I'm saying, you have to understand that human beings are very vulnerable creatures. We have no claws, we can't run very fast, we have no sharp teeth, we have no horns or hooves to defend ourselves. We are essentially at the mercy of the wild unless we're capable of maintaining a sense of belonging within a group. So what shame is a way of an incentive to remove a behavior that could get us cast out of the group. And shame overrides even our sense of self-preservation because it is a part of our sense of self-preservation. If we can't retain access to our group, we're most likely going to die. So shame is a very powerful aversive force. In many ways, even more powerful than pain. It's just as powerful as nausea. So in our psyche, there's the self, which is sort of a continuous experience of who we are. Right? It's the person who's tasting the Cracker Jack. It's the person who's getting sick. It's the person whose tooth really hurts. It's a continuous experience of who we are. But then there's our belief about our self's value, and that could be called ego. Ego can be broken up into two aspects, innate value and earned value. Both of these aspects are granted by the group, but innate value cannot be taken away by your actions. It just is. It reflects the group's value of some quality that you're born with. Now, when we're shamed by the group, we shift out of our experience of self into the earned value aspect of our ego. When we're in the earned value aspect of our ego, we take on the group's appraisal of us and attempt to earn our value by removing whatever offending behavior that we had. And in healthy groups, this is a very important process because there are people who will have behaviors that are toxic, often not just to the group, but also to themselves. And usually a healthy group will say, Stu, you have innate value to us, but this behavior has to go because it's toxic to us and the group and to yourself. Stu, go off, deal with this. When you've dealt with it, you can come back. No questions asked, no blame placed. Just you need to deal with it. Please come back as soon as you have. That's a healthy group. But what if the group tells Stu that it isn't his behavior that's the problem? It's Stu himself. The group is effectively shaming Stu for being Stu, but Stu can't get rid of being Stu because he is Stu. So what happens then? When that happens, the person who's being shamed for something that he can't change will spend the rest of his life attempting to vomit up something he can't get rid of, his innate being. Now this is exactly as excruciating as it sounds. And in that situation, those individuals who have been shamed by saying that they have no innate value to the group, or even that their innate value is dangerous and damaging to the group, they will search for something to value. Those lacking value will search for something of value. For the obvious reason is if you have nothing to value in your life, it's empty and meaningless. But there's another reason to it. When you have nothing of value in your life, you're essentially skinless. If you have nothing of value, then you have nothing to lose. If you have nothing to lose, nothing can give you pain. But then again, nothing can give you pleasure either. What skin is, what this skin that these people are seeking is boundaries. When a person who's part of this shamed group goes through this process of having this innate part of their being shamed to the point where they're constantly trying to essentially vomit it out of themselves, of course they can't, what ends up happening is that they vomit themselves out of their own skin. And that's exactly as excruciating as it sounds. And this is why when a member of the slave class, a member of the shamed class, has no value to serve, that slave, well, he has a tendency to put a gun under his chin and pull the trigger. And that person is going to live permanently in the earned value aspect of his ego. And he's going to be addicted to pride because pride gives him the false impression that he's managed to vomit up his own entrails, his own inner being. It's also why a member of the shamed class orientates himself to the first suitable threat narrative he can find. Threat narratives serve the shamed class, the slave class, as a skin that they can put on and feel like they have some sort of containment, some sort of sense of purpose and belonging, boundaries. And this process is what weaponizes a threat narrative. On its own, a threat narrative is merely boundaries. When a threat narrative is populated by slave cells that will kill or die in its service, that's when a threat narrative becomes deadly. Now, this desire to take on a set of vulnerabilities created by something of value, this need for that, this need for a skin, creates an economy. This economy, and I'll call it the shame economy, this economy is controlled exclusively by the master class. In fact, it could also be called the master economy, since all other economies answer to it. All other economies serve the shame economy. Despite its ultimate supremacy over all other economies, it's hidden in plain sight. And it's hidden by interconnecting layers of psychological blind spots. The first and most important of which is the belief that the slave class is more powerful than the master class. This belief not only hides the shame economy, it drives it. Again, you have to have value to have vulnerabilities. If you have no value, you have no vulnerabilities, you have nothing to lose. That's why the slave is seen as more powerful than the master, because the slave is seen as having no vulnerabilities, because they have no value. In the slavery sweet spot, I explained that in a system of slavery, a master is seen as the source of the slave's belonging, while the slave has a desire to relieve his sense of powerlessness through dominance. When the slave's desire to belong to his master is in balance with his desire to dominate her, you get the perfect slave. In this situation, the master's vulnerabilities offer the slave the opportunity to relieve his sense of powerlessness. His master's vulnerabilities also offer the slave a way of getting into a skin so he can relieve the excruciating feeling of being skinless. For obvious reasons, if the slave sees himself as more vulnerable, the system stops working. In fact, the slave will resist this outcome. In fact, the slave will resist this outcome because it means the loss of his drug, pride. Pride being that illusionary belief that a slave has finally vomited out whatever society doesn't like about him, which is impossible because you cannot vomit out the thing that is doing the vomiting. And because it's this pride in serving his master's vulnerabilities that the slave is after, this is his primary drive as a slave, is pride. Pride to soothe the powerlessness, pride to soothe that nausea, give a break from the shame. A slave will want to retain his belief that his master is delicate, submissive, and weak because that ensures a constant supply of vulnerability to serve, while hiding the slave's powerlessness from view. The Hollywood fiction is that the slave serves the master with a simmering resentment in his heart. The reality is that most slaves were eager to serve. The reality is the system of slavery honors the slave mind. This was their life. The slaves are almost more invested in perpetuating the system of slavery than the master is, because the system of slavery gives them what they have now been created to crave. Ironically, in this system, in the slave system, in the system where there's a shamed class and a master class, the master's weakness is her wealth. And you'll see situations in which members of a master class compete to create displays of weakness, and also displays of value. In some cases, with their displays of weakness, with the master class's displays of weakness, they will go so far as to alter their bodies to appear more vulnerable. In the shame economy, the master's vulnerability is currency. It's currency because the slave wants it more than life itself. Shame and vulnerability is, in fact, the basis of all currency: political, economic, social, religious, and even military. So why does a system of slavery exist only as long as the master is seen as more vulnerable than the slave? Because when slaves start to recognize their vulnerability, they begin the process of shedding the master's skin and growing their own.